Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Norman Smith. Joining me for the duration is Chris Philp, the Conservative MP for Croydon South, and Siobhan McDonough, the Labour MP for Mitcham and Morden. So I want to start with the latest from Chequers, where the Cabinet has reached a collective agreement on the UK's relationship with the EU after Britain leaves it. Ministers have signed up to a plan to create a free trade area for industrial and agricultural goods with the bloc, based on a common rulebook and supported by a combined customs territory. The Cabinet also accepted that Britain would end up with less access to EU markets for financial services. Chris Philp, is this a good plan for London?
It is a good plan for London because it means we respect the result of the referendum, taking back control over things like borders, money and laws, at the same time making sure goods can flow freely, make sure we don't have friction at the border, particularly the Northern Ireland border, which is so important, but also ports like Dover and Felixstowe as well. Now, you asked about financial services, and clearly we're not proposing to remain in the single market for financial services.
Should we be worried about that? Because financial services is massive.
Well, it's a question. It's a question I asked in Downing Street yesterday morning at a briefing I attended as a London MP. Clearly, financial services is very important to London. And the answer I got to that question was that the city itself, financial services itself, actually doesn't want us to be tied into a current and indeed future
But presumably
European
they want
regulation.
still to have easy access to European markets.
That's right. But let me just finish the point about if we were to go into a single market for financial services, as we are doing for products, whereas the rule book for products is quite stable, it's evolved over many years, with financial services, we believe they are intending to do things there which would disadvantage
There's a lot
the City
coming
of London,
down the line. Yeah, no, I understand
which will
that.
disadvantage the city.
Let me ask Siobhan McDonough, do you think we should be relaxed about the fact there is not a deal for financial services as there is for goods and agriculture and food?
I think we should be absolutely terrified there isn't a deal for services, because services represent 80% of our economy and they represent even more of London's economy. It's not just the financial services, it's tech, it's the arts, it's music, it's people working in a call centre. The idea that it's kind of, for London, this is...
But Chris's point is that actually there's a lot of EU regulation coming down the line which people in the city actually are quite glad not to be tied in because it will inhibit and harm the city.
But services are bigger than the city. They employ more people. And London provide 80–90% of our economy is dependent on services, with tens of thousands of jobs. And when it comes to it, London is only one of 2 regions that creates more tax than it spends. So if London catches a cold and can't pay that tax, nobody's health service is getting paid.
Let me explain what the plan for services is. So the plan for services is different to goods. I think the intention with services is to say that we will enter into some kind of mutual recognition agreement where well, let me explain how it works. Let me explain how it works before you interrupt. Let me just explain how it works.
I think so. I think we're witnessing it.
Let me explain how it works. There'll be mutual recognition where we agree to maintain equivalent regulatory standards to the European Union in exchange for market access. Now, that market access will be more limited than it is now because we're not agreeing to abide by all of the rules, but it strikes a sensible compromise between market access and signing up to all of their rules.
Let me put this to you. We have heard plenty from the likes of Airbus, BMW, and the reason we've heard plenty from them is it's very hard to move manufacturing plants, car plants. It's very easy to move banks. You just have to move your offices. It's not the same. So they're pretty relaxed and they take the view, OK, if Brexit doesn't work out, we're off.
Well, I don't think
it's
they will
more
move.
than the banks. It's the tech companies. It's the music industry. It's so much more. And it's so many people's livelihoods. The idea that it can simply... we had this vote 2 years ago. We're already 1 year into voting on Article 50, and we're only now got to where we've got this kind of vague plan that we're going to represent to the EU.
And Chris, the issue which Siobhan makes is the scale of the impact of financial services on London is not just financial services, but broader service sector is massive. So the fact there is not deal, the ramifications for London could be huge.
Well, to say there's no plan is completely inaccurate. There's going to be, I think, a sort of 200-page document.
Well, there's an aspiration, but there isn't a plan.
Published on Thursday this coming week, in just 4 days' time, that will lay out in huge detail the plan for financial services as well as for the rest of the economy. Of course, we then need to negotiate that with Europe. So there is absolutely a plan, and it's a plan that's been developed over the last year or two in consultation with leading city figures. And if you look at all of the projections for doom and gloom, including from the Labour Party in the last 2 years, about how, you know, thousands of jobs are going to be moving already, actually a handful of jobs have gone overseas. All of these doom mongers have been wrong.
Companies have made contingency plans to base themselves in Dublin, in other cities across Europe. The idea that, you know, it's not just the city, it's more than that. It's more people's jobs, it's more people's livelihoods.
Why has London's voice not been heard then?
It has been heard.
I don't think it has. I think the whole issue, this is about how does the Tory party get itself to first base. It isn't about how we all keep our jobs and pay our taxes and keep our NHS on the road or pay for our schools. I mean, we've not got to that point, because at the moment it's trying to get the Cabinet to agree. Now it's about getting the Conservative parliamentary party to agree.
Let's leave it there, folks, and move on. Now, the National Health Service celebrated its 70th birthday this week. A revered institution, perhaps, but is it still serving London well, and should more autonomy be devolved to London? Carl Mercer went to St George's Hospital in Tooting in South London on Thursday to find out.
A birthday in every sense for the NHS and for Leo, born just after 9:15 this morning.
Oh, that's great.
Leo will get a special baby grow. His parents, their own special gift, as the NHS itself celebrates.
It's amazing. I mean, this is our second child. We have a daughter, and we've been so well looked after, and it's such an amazing system. So, yeah, we are very, very pleased.
From a maternity room to the grander surroundings of the plush Lanesborough Hotel in central London, where St George's used to be, and where Lucy Titheridge was actually born. She retires next year after 35 years. So what will she miss?
Oh, the people more than anything. And probably, you know, I guess the patients and having a purpose. You know, you become quite institutionalised, I guess. You know, it's been my life for such a long time, and it's a great big part of my life. On then for a special photo op in Hyde Park before a walk back to the hospital.
Abdomen, lung contusions, leg pain.
Here in the emergency department, it's busy as usual. They'll see around 500 patients today. 100 will be admitted. This is one of London's 4 major trauma centres.
We're in purpose-built, state-of-the-art environments now. We have helicopters coming out the sky and landing on the roof. It's a very, very different place and a very different way of treating people and looking after patients.
Happy birthday, NHS! Well, I was born in Tooting. My brother was born in St George's itself. My 2 daughters were born here. St George's saved my father's life. My mum works here, and I work here as a doctor in the A&E, and I love it.
Who worked at St George's?
All of us. All of us.
How long for?
I worked at St George's for nearly 30 years.
And I the same
I
as well.
worked here for 43 years.
Really?
Yeah,
because we...
Is that because you liked it, or no one else? Or no one else would have you?
No one else would have me.
And I worked for 41 years, retired last year, and come back, and I'm on the bank. Good midwives, and I was head of midwifery at one stage here.
Well, you would say it was good midwife. Leo will tell you today's midwives has been carrying on that tradition. Life, as they say, goes on.
Carl Mercer reporting. Siobhan, do you think there is a strong case for devolving more NHS services to London?
I would love some elected accountability in our NHS. What I find locally with the NHS, they make decisions without reference to people and how people feel. And I felt for a very long time that services are taken away from poorer areas and put off in better off ones. I'm about to go through my 7th campaign to keep my A&E and my maternity unit at St Helier Hospital, because the NHS wants to put it somewhere much better off and way for those people who need it. So I love St George's, it's the bottom of my street, but for St George's to stay safe, they need the A&E at St Helier to stay open, because without them it's simply going to go under the pressure.
Chris, we saw quite a big push under the former Chancellor George Osborne to devolve NHS services in Greater Manchester, and it seemed to be a coming idea, which now seems to have gone on the back burner. Should it be placed on the back burner? Is it just a fad, the idea of devolving services at this sort of level?
Well, I think the idea in Manchester was partly to get health and social care working better together by putting them under the orbit of the Greater Manchester Mayor. So I think we should probably wait and see how that works in practice before we draw conclusions about how we could do things more widely. I mean, in general, grand reorganisations of the NHS often don't yield the benefits they're supposed to, but cost lots of money. So I think what we probably should do is wait and see how Greater Manchester beds in before making decisions. I would take exception about the idea that NHS services are taken away from poorer areas. I mean, that's nonsense. If you look at Croydon University Hospital, which is just having a brand new, fantastic A&E, is in one of the most deprived parts of the borough. So the NHS serves the whole country, and some of our best hospitals are in the most deprived areas.
Siobhan, let me put this to you. If services were devolved to London, isn't there a danger, actually, that the rest of the country would lose out? Because we have, obviously, you know, some of the leading teaching hospitals in the world in London. The resources and expertise and skill is in London, and therefore other parts of the country will lose the same sort of access that they currently have.
But the tension already exists between providing a local service and providing a regional and national service. If you looked at St George's, they're in terrible financial straits precisely because they do the high-end countrywide stuff for which they don't get the same level of payment they do for local services. So I don't think devolving more power makes that pressure come about. That pressure exists right now.
And Chris, you mentioned the Manchester example and bringing together health and social care. Surely that actually supports the case for devolving services to London, because we know there's a huge argument about social care, but the difficulty is, at a national level, all sorts of competing political arguments come to bear and we get to gridlock. We've been in gridlock for about 20 years on social care. If it's devolved at a local level, much easier to make things happen.
Although, of course, social care in London is delivered by the 33 London boroughs, not by the Mayor of London. So you'd have to sort of devolve down with the NHS and devolve up from the London boroughs. It would be quite a complicated reorganisation. And as we've seen in the recent past, you know, more than once, complicated NHS reorganisations often don't work as they're intended and can waste money.
But, it is central, isn't it? I mean, they are doing it in Scotland. So if they can do it in Scotland, why on earth can't they do it?
So I think we should just be very thoughtful before changing structures too much. So let's look at the Scottish example, let's look at the Greater Manchester example. Of course, on the funding point that Siobhan just touched on, you know, the NHS is about to get an enormous funding increase, £20 billion
Can we be a bit more realistic about that? It's great to have any increase, but at 4%, it's less than the Labour government introduced every single year, and we're just going through...
It's more than Labour promised in the last election.
We're going through 10 years of some of the smallest increases, but the most important thing is, you know, we can bandy about figures, but it's this quality of service people are getting, and we all know from turning up at A&E, the A&E waits are up, times for appointments are up. For the first time in 21 years as an MP, I'm getting lots of correspondence about delayed appointments or appointments far off, and that's what we need to sort.
Is the problem, I mean, let's just put the money to one side because we can argue about that till the cows come home. Is part of the problem that the energy and appetite has gone out of reform of the NHS?
I think the appetite for reform is always there. I think one of the problems...
Really? Aren't people shy of it now after sort of the Lansley reforms?
No, I think people... I mean, if you look at our care of the elderly, what we know is you can put as much money as you like in the NHS, but if we don't do something about councils and social care, and councils have had their budgets cut by 40%, they'll simply have older people stuck in hospital wards where they shouldn't be and it isn't in their best interest. And it costs for 1 week the same amount to stay in hospital as it would for a month for an elderly person to be cared for in their own home.
But when I listen to your leader talking about the NHS, I mean, he seems really to be trying to wind the clock back, stripping out all private sector involvement. And you look across at the continent, they have perfectly good health services in Germany and France. Isn't there a sense that he has closed his mind to real reform of the NHS, which money alone is not going to solve?
No. Well, I'm sure Jeremy supports an NHS, a care at the point of delivery. Once you've got that fundamental principle there, you can work back as how best to provide it.
OK, let's leave it there. Now, tens of thousands of young women and girls in London are experiencing period poverty, according to campaigners and research conducted by City Hall. Period poverty is a term that refers to being unable to access sanitary products because of financial challenges. In March, the government allocated some money from the tampon tax to help alleviate period poverty, but campaigners say that doesn't go far enough. Bhavani Vadi reports.
There are a range of sanitary products to help women manage their period every month, but for many, cost is the main concern. It's something these Year 9 pupils from Eltham Hill School in Lewisham are aware of.
So you know friends who had to miss school because they can't afford to buy a sanitary product?
Yeah, it's really upsetting. I know a few people who told me that they had to use unwanted underwear such as socks to use that as a cover for sanitary products because they wasn't able to buy it themselves.
How common is this? How frequently does that happen?
I think it's quite common. It's more common than people think. People sometimes maybe get embarrassed because of it.
But we were talking about how contraception is like free in most chemists, and I feel like it should be like that because getting your period isn't a choice.
A former teacher at the school, Becky Lopez, runs the Red Box project in South East London, which collects donations of sanitary products and redistributes them. It's a community initiative run by volunteers.
We know that in London there are growing issues of child poverty, so girls haven't got access to the sanitary products they need. The basic necessities to get people to school and to allow them to go about their school day are all provided for. There are school meals, toilet roll is provided, but yet we're saying to girls, boys can come to school and they can fully participate, but girls, if you can't afford sanitary products, your education isn't worth that to us.
In London, around 1 in 7 of girls aged between 14 and 21 have at some stage been unable to afford sanitary products, according to a weighted survey carried out by the girls' rights charity Plan International UK. Around half of those young women have also been forced to create makeshift sanitary protection by using things like toilet roll and socks as replacements for pads and tampons. Last year, A-level student Amika George started the campaign to get the government to offer free menstrual products to girls on free school meals. It led to a demo in Westminster in December, attended by some high-profile celebrities. Since then, the government has allocated £1.5 million to address period poverty in England, but she doesn't believe that goes far enough.
It needs to be a long-term statutory pledge. I think it needs to be forever. It needs to be sanitary products in schools and one day all workplaces, hospitals, all public spaces, just to be able to ensure that no women will ever be discriminated against for being on their period.
The Department for Education told us that recent analysis shows no evidence that period poverty has a significant nationwide impact on school attendance, and that schools can use their pupil premium funding to buy sanitary products for pupils if necessary. But some MPs are getting behind the campaigners, with one breaking a taboo in Parliament last week.
Perhaps will excuse me for my lateness, that today I'm on my period. And it's cost me this week already £25. Many women can't afford this. Yeah. What is the Minister doing to address period poverty?
The government is under pressure to follow the lead of the Scottish Parliament and offer free sanitary products to women on low incomes. The Greens and the Lib Dems have committed to tackling period poverty in their manifestos, with Labour making a similar pledge. Will the party of government follow the trend?
Bhavani Vadi reporting there. Well, I'm joined by Gemma Abbott from the Red Box project in Hackney. And I should say, before I start, that we approached female journalists who felt the issue of period poverty had been overstated, but they declined to appear on the programme. Gemma, I mean, I suppose the key thing is this really a significant problem? Because people will say, well, you can buy a box of tampons, 20 or so, for £1, £2. Surely families can afford that.
Well, I think I'd start by saying I don't think that there's many teenage girls responsible for their own household finances. So I don't really want to live in a society where we blame or punish children for the acts or the omissions of their parents. I don't think that's right. And it's true that you can get products quite cheaply at the supermarket-owned brands, but they're not appropriate for everyone. Different women experience different periods. People bleed more heavily, they bleed for longer. Those products aren't always appropriate. And I think that to state that families are incapable of stretching an extra couple of pounds a month is to really misunderstand the depth and the scale of poverty that's experienced in the UK at the moment. In the borough of Hackney, where I live and where I coordinate one of the Red Box projects, we have a child poverty rate of 41%. Our local food bank, the Hackney Food Bank, had increased usage of 24% last year. Those are huge numbers. So we know period poverty is a facet of poverty.
Let me put it, well, that's the point I was going to make. Let me put it to you. The issue is poverty, not period poverty. If families are poor, they will have trouble getting their children to work. They will have trouble getting the appropriate clothes. So actually, is this just an argument about poverty rather than period poverty?
Well, I think there is a huge issue about poverty in this country, but I suppose the issue about period poverty is that there's a huge stigma around it. People don't talk about it. It's existed for a long time, you know, presumably since women have been menstruating, and only recently have people begun to talk about it.
And is it appropriate, though, for the state to intervene?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to live in a society where we have a welfare state, where the government is responsible for the neediest, the most vulnerable people in our society. That's what we need.
But if the issue is girls perhaps not going to school because of period poverty, surely you could equally say, well, there are many more significant reasons for school absences. I mean, mental health, poor parenting, difficult home circumstances. I mean, there are huge issues which contribute to absences from school. Is period poverty really up there with those sort of issues?
Well, yes, we think it is. This issue isn't being overstated, and I think Department for Education reports that purport to conclude, although actually they didn't draw any conclusions in that report, and only later in their statements have they said that their analysis concluded this, that they've used existing data that had no data around period poverty. People hadn't reported on period poverty, and they tried to conclude that there was no link between attendance and period poverty. But we don't know. I mean, girls don't tell teachers why they're not at school.
OK, Siobhan, let me bring you in here. I mean, I suppose the question is, how big an issue is this? When you think of the difficulties young women face, I mean, you can think of many, many issues, whether it be sexual harassment or equal pay or whatever. Period poverty is a serious issue?
Yeah, but Norman, we don't say harassment at work is not as big a problem as the starving of the world. When did it become an issue that we only deal with some issues and not all? I mean, you could argue that this actually, financially, is not a huge problem to solve. That actually it's something... What
sort of sums do you think you'd need to...
We're talking to Gemma earlier, and I think that she was telling us that Scottish Government, for their nationwide pilot, they're spending £500,000 on the products, which is not unfindable. I mean, I think Chris agreed that that wasn't a figure that you couldn't find. What I would say, though, I thought the young women on your video were extraordinary. How confident, how great were they? And I'm sure we've used the word period more in this show than we have entire Sunday politics, which is we're destigmatising it. Because I was wondering what schoolgirl would say to their teacher, I'm sorry I couldn't come to school.
Let me just give Chris an answer here. I mean, we know the Scottish Government are moving on this, the opposition parties are moving on this. Do you think the government is going to be able to continue to say, actually, it's not something we're going to deal with?
Well, I think the government is beginning to move. We obviously took the VAT rate as low as we legally could a couple of years ago, down to 5%. It'll go to 0% pretty shortly. Gemma mentioned the £1.5 million that's already been put into it, so 3 times higher than the Scottish Government. And you mentioned data earlier. I think from December this year, questions about period poverty will be asked in the formal survey, so we can get a proper handle on it and take action as appropriate, because it's a very serious point.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there, folks. Thanks. Thanks to Chris, Siobhan and Gemma. That, I'm afraid, is all we have time for today.